Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today's video is part 2 of the two-part series dedicated to the GT hubs. The first video I made was focused on the race hubs and their generations. I'll leave a link to that video in case you missed it. In this video, which was highly anticipated, we go over the Superlace hubs and their generations. So let's go back in time to the 1980s. The credit of the original Superlace design is once again owed to Brian Skura, who invented the Odyssey gyro. Skura Speed and Tech came up with the race lace technology and design as early as 1984, well before the GT Superlace hubs came out. Brian rode for GT from 1984 to 1988. Here's an early ad from SST showing the race lace hubs, and while these are extremely different from the Superlace hubs, I want you to focus your attention on the staggered spoke holes on the two different bolt circle diameters. One larger on the outer hole and one smaller on the inner holes. And yes, Brian invented the Superlace hubs we know today.
That's this right here.
That hub, there's only one of those.
The silver one.
Yeah, this is a production one. This is the handmade. This is the first ever handmade.
And what's the story behind this back here?
Well, this is a Woody Instant coaster brake hub.
Okay.
Okay.
On the left.
Yeah, and then this is a GT Superlace hub. I designed that for GT.
All right.
Yeah, so that's.
By utilizing this staggered spoke hole design in a 36-hole arrangement, the lacing of the spokes can add extreme strength to the wheel, essentially turning a 36-hole wheel into a 48-spoke set, well, strength-wise. And according to SST, the ad says that the pattern makes the wheels 32% harder to bend. I believe it. So now the origins. Well, you can catch a glimpse of the Superlace hubs in the 1986 catalog. Yeah, that's right, they're in there. But they're shown as a coaster brake, and namely a rear hub. But yes, GT did make coaster brakes in the Superlace pattern for a brief time. So why were Superlace hubs designed, and what problem did they solve? Remember that before the Pro Performer existed in 1984, GT riders would use racing bikes for performing the freestyle tricks. They would use the Interceptor and the Mach 1. These bikes would use low flange hubs with standard lacing patterns. When the Pro Performer was designed, which by the way was done by Eddie Fiola and Bob Morales, it utilized mags. As tricks like the Miami Hopper came into existence, it brought the mags to their absolute limit. GT needed something stronger than 36-spoke wheels, but they didn't want it at the same time with the weight penalty. So the Superlace hubs solved the strength and weight problems simultaneously. The rule sets. GT does not refer to their freestyle Superlace hubs as generational. To be clear, this is what is accepted by the BMX community. GT did not distinguish one generation from another like they did on some of their parts, such as the frame standers. Here they call the whale tails frame standers too. Rule number 1. Superlace hubs are always high flanged. Rule number 2. Superlace hubs are always 36 spoke holes, never 48. Rule number 3. Superlace hubs are always staggered spoke hole with 9 holes on a larger bolt circle and 9 holes on a smaller bolt circle, and these holes must straddle each other. Rule number 4. A significant change to the design dimensionally indicates a revision and constitutes a generational change. Rule number 5. Different generations can be available at the same time period, as GT phased out one design or generation and started utilizing another. In some cases, leftover inventory from mail order or even local bike shops could also mean multiple generations being available in the same time. And again, GT didn't term them as generational. So what we are seeing is simply a revision to the design in which we interpret as a generation change. Rule number 6. Different locking collars or lock nuts and a change to the GT logo does not mean a generation change. This is especially true on the Superlace hubs, as early generations were made in Japan, and as that production shifted, some of the changes to the locking collar showed up. Now, I know I just went over the rule set, but I just want to make this very clear. The following criteria must be met in order to have a Superlace hub. First, they must be high flange design and they must have staggered spoke holes. Additionally, the hubs need to be 36 hole. Now, I bet some of you are going to argue that you have a box with 48-hole GT hubs and they're called Superlace. They're not Superlace. You simply need to refer to them as high-flanged hubs. Currently, GT continues to use the Superlace nomenclature on their new school high-flange hubs. But one could argue that they are not Superlace simply because the bolt holes are not staggered. So let me know in the comments section what you think. Generation 0. Superlace hubs were more refined when compared to their race hubs and their generations. In order to maintain continuity in understanding the generations, we will call the Coaster Brake Superlace hub as Generation 0. Sets came out as rear hub only or front and rear hubs. The hubs were made from aluminum, as were all of the Superlace hubs. Colors available were chrome plate, white, and black. Now, I've heard people say they had Maui blue as well, but there's no provision on the box for blue, and none of the mail order magazines listed blue as a color. Lack of any NOS specimens in blue lead me to believe that this is a myth. Axles were solid, bearings were sealed cartridge 7/8 OD by 3/8 ID by 9/32 thickness. Sealed mechanism was not available, and these used split locking collars and of course the first generation GT bubble font logo on the decal. These were available early 1986 through about 1988 as accessory parts. Yes, you could still purchase them into the 1990s, but as GT stopped production in 1988, these would have basically been leftover inventory or stuff you would have gotten from your local bike shop. GT did not offer these on any complete bikes unless you custom ordered or had them installed by your LBS. And they would have set you back about $35 in 1986 for the rear hub and $50 for the set. I bet you're going to kick yourself in the tush for knowing that, as these unicorns sell for about 30 times what they did in the 1980s. Generation 1. These came as front and rear sets only, and the colors available were chrome plate, white, and black. Axles were hollow chromoly, and this was a change from the solid axles from Generation 0. And bearings were sealed cartridge, 7/8 inch by 3/8 by 9/32, same as Gen 0. Sealed mechanism was not available in this generation, and these used split locking collars and the first generation GT bubble font logo for the decal. They were available 1987 through about 1989. Now, there is some debate as to when Generation 1 Superlace ended and when Generation 2 began, but I've seen a few 1989 Pro Freestyle Tour team model survivors with Generation 1 hubs, and I've also seen some dyno 1989s with Generation 2 hubs. So there was a transition period, and these hubs debuted in 1987 on the Pro Freestyle Tour team model as an upgrade option. Believe it or not, the Pro Freestyle Tour team model in 1987 came with OGK mags, optioned, or Superlace hubs as an option. In 1988, GT started using Superlace hubs exclusively for the Pro Freestyle Tour team model, and that carried on as a tradition moving forward. And the main identifier for Generation 1 hubs, and the fastest way to distinguish them over any other generation, is that they have the thickest hourglass center section at 7/8 inch or 22.5 millimeter. And the flange diameters are also the largest at 2 inch and 29/32. Generation 2. These started to appear in 1989 and into 1990. This was short-lived. This generation wasn't around very long. And yes, Generation 2 is different from Generation 3. I want to thank Benjamin Leithberg, who graciously allowed me to borrow his Generation 2 hubs for measuring all of these features. It's people like him that make this BMX community the very best. Generation 2 were only available on complete bikes to my understanding. They were available in black, white, and chrome plate, and these used sealed cartridge or sealed mechanism, loose ball. The axles were now solid, and this change came because many people would bend their hollow axles. They used the split locking collars on some and jam nuts on the others. First generation GT bubble font logo was also carried over. Now, the main identifier for Generation 2 hubs, and the fastest way to distinguish them over other generations, is that Gen 2 have the thinnest hourglass center sections at 3/4 of an inch or 19 millimeter for the front hub, and slightly larger midsection on the rear hub at 800 thousandths. Now, the flange diameters are much smaller than Gen 1 at 2 and 13/16 of an inch. Now, something very interesting that I noticed in measuring two of these hubs is that on the rear hub, the counterbore depth for the sealed cartridge bearing is like 260 thousandths of an inch, which is shallow. So what you'll notice is that the bearings sometimes stick out beyond the flange face, so they're not flush. That's interesting, and I noticed it on two of them. So let me know in the comment section if you have something like that. Generation 3 were still available well into 1994 as parts until GT transitioned into their Mohawk style hubs. This does not include the 48-spoke high flange hubs, which resemble the Superlace hubs. Now, these are sealed cartridge and sealed mechanism in this generation, although the majority of the hubs that were sold were sealed mechanism. All the axles were solid, and gone were the locking collars from the previous generations. And we now have a newer GT logo for the decals. The main identifier for the Generation 3 hubs, and the quickest way to identify them over Generation 2, is that they have a slightly larger diameter in the hourglass center section at 788 or 20 millimeter, making them slightly larger than Generation 2, but way smaller than Generation 1. Now, the rear hub, it measures 815 thousandths. And let's note that the flange diameters are still smaller than Generation 1, but about on par as Generation 2. Now, take a look at the rear hub for the majority of difference between Gen 2 and Gen 3. And this is where you can see the absolute difference between these two generations, because some argue that they are the same. They are not. On Gen 3, this area that's opposite of the freewheel is narrower, and it is easy to see. Now, colors available were black, white, and chrome plate, but the majority of these hubs came in chrome plate. And that is the end of the Superlace hubs from 1986 to 1994. GT then switched over to their 48-spoke high-flanged hubs in 1993 for the Pro Freestyle Tour, the Team Model, and of course the Slammers. However, GT continued to produce the Generation 3 hubs well into 1994, although there were some changes to the logo and the hardware, but other than that, everything remained the same. When GT finally did move away from this design and introduced their Mohawk hubs for their racing and freestyle or flatland bikes, it was the end of the Superlace as we know it. So which hubs are the most common? Well, that's Generation 1, because there's so many of them. Which hubs are the rarest? Well, that would be Generation 2. And which hubs are the most economical? Well, right now, it's Generation 3. I hope this clears things up for you and sheds some light on the Superlace history and the design changes. And that about wraps up this video. I hope you liked it, and make sure you are subscribed. Ring that bell for notifications. I have a ton of content lined up, but you wouldn't know if you're not subscribed. Now, get back to those builds, whichever generation that is, and let me know in the comment section what you had back in the day. I love reading that stuff. Now, stay safe, stay healthy, and remember, tomorrow is not guaranteed.